The sound of the key turning in the lock was the first sign he was home. It was a tired sound, a metallic scrape that echoed the exhaustion in his own bones. Leo pushed the door open to their small third-floor apartment, and the familiar, comforting scent hit him first, not the lemon-scented chemical that clung to his clothes and skin, but the warm, savory smell of tomato sauce and garlic. Alina was cooking. It was a small thing, but it was everything. He stepped inside, his shoulders slumping forward under an invisible weight. The fluorescent lights of the university hallways had given him a headache, and his lower back ached in that specific way it did after 9 hours of pushing a heavy mop and wringing out dirty water in buckets. His work boots, scuffed and permanently stained, felt like blocks of cement on his feet. He carefully towed them off by the door, not wanting to track any of the day's grime onto their clean floor. Their apartment wasn't much. The living room was just big enough for a second-hand sofa, a wobbly coffee table, and a small television they'd bought from a neighbor. The paint on the walls was a bland, landlord special beige, and in the corner by the window, you could see where the water stain from the upstairs apartment had started to creep in again. Faint, ghostly brown map. But it was home. Elena's books were stacked neatly on the sofa arm. A colorful crochet blanket was draped over the back, and on the windowsill, a small, stubborn pot of basil was reaching for the afternoon sun. Alina was in the small kitchenette, her back to him. She was humming a little tune, stirring something in a pot. She wore her simple gray work pants and a white shirt, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Seeing her like this, so domestic and calm, made the tension in his chest ease just a little. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. She smelled like herself, like clean laundry and a hint of the lavender hand cream she used. "Hey," he whispered, his voice raspy. She leaned into him, her stirring hand stilling for a moment. "Hey, you. Long day." "The longest," he said into her hair. A professor spilled an entire tray of ancient artifacts in the humanities wing. "I think I swept up the dust of a pharaoh," she chuckled, a soft, warm sound that vibrated through his chest. "Poor baby. Go sit down. Dinner's almost ready. I made pasta." He gave her a final squeeze and let go, sinking into the worn cushions of the sofa. The physical relief was immense, but as he sat there, the mental weight began to settle back in. His eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where his guitar stood leaning against the wall. It was an old acoustic, its finish scratched and dulled with age, a gift from his father when he was 15. It wasn't a fancy instrument, but the wood felt like an extension of his own body. He ran his gaze along its curves, his fingers instinctively twitching. Wanting to feel the strings under his calloused fingertips, he had started playing it tonight. For just a few minutes, before Alina had come home. It was his ritual, the one thing that could wash the day's grime from his soul. He would close the door to their cramped space, sit on that very sofa, and let his fingers find the frets. The melodies didn't always come easily. Sometimes they were clumsy and frustrating. But when they did, it was like finding a clear spring in the middle of a desert. For those few moments, he wasn't a janitor. He was just a man with a song. Alina brought over 2 plates of steaming spaghetti. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, their forks scraping against the plates. It was their routine, their dance. He would tell her about the small dramas of the university, the lost student IDs, the clogged toilets, the eccentric professors, and she would listen with a patient smile, occasionally sharing a story about the demanding law firm where she worked as a paralegal. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was heavier, charged with something unsaid. He could feel her eyes on him as he ate. When he looked up, she wasn't smiling. She had that look he knew well, the one that was a mix of love and deep gnawing worry. "What is it?" he asked, putting down his fork. She sighed, a small weary sound. "The rent is due Friday, Leo, and the electric bill came." He nodded slowly, his appetite suddenly gone. "I know. I'll have my paycheck. I can cover it." "It's not just that," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's everything." Her gaze flickered from his face to the guitar in the corner, then back again. "You were playing when I came in?" "I always play." "Oh, it was a new one. It was beautiful, Leo. It sounded so sad and so hopeful all at once. She paused, searching for the right words, and he could see the struggle in her eyes. That's the problem. That's what makes this so hard. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Alina, we've talked about this. I'm trying. I send demos. I call venues. I know you do. I see how tired you are. I see you falling asleep on the sofa with that guitar in your lap. I see the hope in your eyes when you talk about it, and it breaks my heart. Her voice began to tremble slightly. But hope doesn't pay the rent, Leo. Love doesn't fix the leak in the ceiling. I'm working, he said, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. I'm working every day at a job I hate to make sure we have a roof over our heads. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. That's not what I'm saying. She got up and started pacing the small length of the living room, her movements agitated. I love you. I love that you come home smelling like bleach, and that you make sure I have tea in the cupboard, that you listen to me complain about my boss. I love you more than anything. Then why are we having this conversation? He asked, his voice quiet. She stopped in front of him, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Because I'm scared. I'm 27 years old. I want a life with you. A real one. I want a house where we don't have to worry about the stain on the ceiling. I want to be able to think about having kids one day. And I can't do that when I don't know if we'll have enough money for groceries next month. The words were like small, sharp stones, and each one hit its mark. He felt a familiar shame wash over him. He wanted to give her the world, but all he had to offer was a small, stained apartment, and a dream that felt further away every day. I don't know what you want me to do, said, his voice barely audible. Stop playing? No, she said, her voice cracking. God, no. That's the last thing I want. That would be like asking you to stop breathing. She knelt down in front of him, taking his rough, work-worn hands in hers. They were so different from her own, which were soft and smooth. She looked directly into his eyes, her own filled with tears that were determined not to fall. I need to know this is real, Leo. I need to know that this beautiful thing inside of you, this music, I need to know it's not just a hobby, that it's not just an escape. I need to know it has a place in the world, not just in this corner of our living room. He saw it then, not as an attack, but as a plea. She was begging for a lifeline, for a sign that their future wouldn't always be this precarious. She wasn't asking him to give up his dream. She was asking him to fight for it with everything he had. How do I do that? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. She took a deep, steadying breath. The words she said next would change everything. They were the most loving and the most terrifying words he had ever heard. You prove it, she said, her voice low and steady, a final, desperate offer. You take that music, that beautiful, heartbreaking music inside of you, and you show me it's more than a song. You get one gig, one real paying gig. You get one person, just one person who doesn't know you, to listen and to tell you it's something special. Prove to me that it's a path you can walk. She squeezed his hands, her eyes locked on his. Prove it, she whispered, the final piece of the ultimatum landing softly between them. And I'll marry you. I'll marry you tomorrow. The room went silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, all faded away. All he could see was her face, etched with a love so fierce it had become a challenge. All he could feel was the rough texture of his own calloused hands in hers, and the distant pull of the guitar in the corner. She wasn't asking him to stop being who he was. She was asking him to become who he was meant to be. He looked from her earnest, pleading eyes to his hands, then over to the old guitar waiting in the corner. A slow, quiet resolve began to settle in his heart. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was just certainty. This was it. This was the moment he had been secretly dreading and secretly hoping for. He looked back at her, his gaze clear and steady. He nodded once, a simple, firm gesture. Okay, he said softly. I'll prove it. The promise he made to the echo of that quiet apartment didn't just the moment the sun began to rise. It wasn't the promise, was an invisible force of love. He had toiled away at the job. He'd always been good with tools, with things. The one in the inner world that didn't always make sense, but now, with its sharp edges and cold demands, the challenge felt monumental. Each morning, he would leave Alina sleeping, the soft light of dawn just beginning to fill their small living space. And the sound of the door of the apartment to his new job was a sound of opportunity. The night before, he had found a flyer for a job, but it was a job. It paid well, and it was a stepping stone. He needed to get to the university early to start his real job. The hours were long, the work was grueling, and the pay was just enough to keep their heads above water. But he knew that this wash rag and bucket were not his destiny. They were just a means to an end. He had to keep telling himself that his days began to split into two distinct halves. The first half was the janitor. He'd punch in, the clock's loud clack, a sound of resignation. He'd push his noisy cart through the echoing hallways, the smell of disinfectant, a constant companion. He'd mop the floors of the lecture halls where he imagined students were learning things that would actually lead somewhere. He'd clean the bathrooms, scrubbing away the grime, feeling like he was scrubbing away a little piece of himself each time. He'd see the posters for student concerts, for art exhibitions, for guest lecturers who were experts in their fields. They felt like taunts, reminders of a world he was only polishing the floors for. The second half of his life began the moment he got home. He'd eat the dinner Elena had so patiently made, his mind already a million miles away. He'd try to listen to her stories about her day at the law firm, about the difficult clients and the endless paperwork, but the melodies in his head were louder. He'd nod and smile, but his fingers would be twitching under the table, aching for the fretboard of his guitar. As soon as the dishes were cleared, he'd retreat to the corner of the living room. Alina would watch him go, her expression a mixture of hope and deepening concern. He'd pull out his old laptop, the one with the cracked screen and the sticky G key, and he'd work. He spent hours hunched over it, his back aching from the day's labor, trying to teach himself how to use the basic recording software he'd downloaded. He'd record take after take of his songs, his voice sometimes cracking with fatigue, his fingers fumbling on the strings. The files would pile up on his desktop, labeled song_idea_3, guitar_stuff_final, vocals_try_again. Then came the sending. He'd spend hours searching online for anyone who might listen. He'd find email addresses for small indie labels, for local radio stations, for music blogs he'd never heard of. He'd write a different email for each one, trying to sound professional, trying to sound confident, trying to sound like he wasn't just some guy who cleaned toilets for a living. "Dear name," he would type, his heart thumping in his chest. "My name is Leo. I am a singer-songwriter, ... He would attach the MP3 file, hit send, and then hold his breath, and then he would wait. The waiting was the worst part. For the first few days, he would obsessively check his email, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach every time he logged in. But all he ever got back were automated replies. "Thank you for your submission. Due to the high volume of emails we receive, we can only respond if we are interested." The silence on the other end was deafening. It was a wall of indifference, and he was throwing his heart against it, only to have it bounce back. Bruised and silent, weeks turned into a month. The initial fire of his promise began to flicker. The exhaustion from his day job was no longer a physical ache. It was a deep, bone-weary fatigue that seeped into his spirit. He'd come home, and the guitar in the corner would sometimes look like an accuser. It represented the promise, the dream, the thing that was putting this enormous strain on their life. Alina watched it all happen. She saw the light in his eyes dimming, replaced by a quiet, stubborn frustration. She saw him fall asleep on the sofa with the laptop still open on his chest, the guitar resting beside him. It hurt her to see it. She had never meant to crush him. She had only wanted him to fly. But now it looked like he was just beating his wings against the inside of a cage. One night she decided to intervene. She came home from work carrying a thick, glossy course catalog from the local community college. She sat down next to him on the sofa, where he was staring blankly at the laptop screen. He looked up, and his expression was so defeated it made her chest ache. "I was thinking," she began, her voice gentle. "I was looking at this. They have a great program for facilities management. You could get a certificate. In a year, you could be a building supervisor. Better pay, better hours." She pointed to a picture in the catalog of a smiling, professional-looking man in a hard hat. "You're already so good at your job, Leo. You know every inch of that university. This would just be a next step, a safety net." He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the catalog, then at his own hands, the same hands he'd shown her on the night she issued her challenge. But now, they just looked like the hands of a janitor. "A safety net," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You mean a parachute? For when I fail? No. That's not what I mean at all," she said quickly, her voice rising with a hint of desperation. "I'm just trying to be practical. I'm trying to help. We can't live on a maybe, Leo. I can't. I love you. But I have to think about our future." "My future is in that corner," he said, his voice low and quiet, pointing a finger at the guitar without looking at it. "You're the one who told me to prove it. And you're not. You're just getting tired," she shot back, her frustration finally bubbling over. "And it's breaking my heart to watch you kill yourself for something that isn't happening. I'm trying to offer you a real path, something solid. It's not a path I want to walk." He stood up, his voice finally breaking. "The only reason I'm doing any of this is because of that promise you made. I'm doing this for us. So I can watch you fade away? Is that the life you want for us?" The words hung between them, sharp and unforgivable, in the quiet of their small apartment. The silence that followed was worse than any argument. It was filled with all the unspoken fears and disappointments that had been growing between them. He finally looked at her, and he saw the tears she was trying to fight back. He saw not a lack of faith, but a terror of a life lived on the edge of poverty and uncertainty. He saw the woman he loved, offering him what she believed was a life raft. And all he could do was see it as an anchor. He sank back onto the sofa, the fight draining out of him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I'm so tired." Alina sat down next to him, a careful distance between them. "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry too. I worry." The ultimatum was still there, a third person in their relationship, a constant ticking clock. It wasn't just about a gig anymore. It was about whether their love was strong enough to survive the strain of a dream. She was pulling toward the shore, toward safety and stability. And he was trying to swim out to sea, toward a distant, invisible shore of his own. He was beginning to wonder if he was swimming toward nothing at all. Doubt, cold and heavy, began to seep into the cracks of his resolve. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. Maybe he was just a janitor with a guitar and a hopeless fantasy. The promise he had made, once a fire in his belly, now felt like a heavy stone around his neck, pulling him down. He started to wonder which would be worse, failing the challenge, or never having tried it at all. The thought was a quiet, terrifying ache in the dead of night. The doubt that had settled in his heart after the argument with Alina was a heavy, gray blanket, smothering the last embers of hope. For days, the guitar in the corner of their small apartment had remained silent. He would come home from the university, the smell of floor wax and disinfectant clinging to him like a second skin, and the thought of picking up the instrument felt like another chore. Another mountain to climb on legs that were already exhausted. The fight in him felt like it had been snuffed out, replaced by a dull, throbbing resignation. He felt like a failure, not because he hadn't succeeded, but because he had lost the will to even try. He could feel Alina watching him, her concern a palpable thing in the small space between them, and he hated it. He hated the pity he saw in her eyes more than he hated the dirty floors or the low pay. One rainy Tuesday, the atmosphere at the university felt different. It was charged with a kind of highbrow panic that normally didn't touch the world of a janitor. A world-famous symphony from across the country was doing a special residency, and tonight was their big gala performance. All the staff, from the university chancellor down to the cafeteria workers, were on edge. Everything had to be perfect. His supervisor had been on his case all day. It's making him re-wax the floors in the grand lobby until they shone like polished glass. He felt like an invisible hand, making the world beautiful for others, while his own world felt dull and crumbling. As his shift wound down, he was assigned the final, most prestigious task, cleaning the main concert hall. It was a magnificent room with plush red velvet seats that seemed to swallow the light, gilded balconies, and a massive domed ceiling painted with floating chubby cherubs. Leo usually loved being in here when it was empty. The acoustics were so pure, a single whisper could travel to the highest row of seats. He would sometimes stand on the stage and hum, to hear the sound bloom and expand in the space around him. Tonight, however, the hall was not empty. It was buzzing with a frantic low-grade fever of anxiety. He could hear voices raised in heated debate from the wings of the stage. He quietly pushed his mop and bucket towards the far side of the room, trying to stay out of the way, his head down, making himself small. He just wanted to finish his job and go home to the silent tension that awaited him. As he got closer to the stage, conversation became clearer. A man with wild white hair and an expensive-looking suit, who he recognized from the promotional posters as the world-famous conductor, was gesturing wildly. A few anxious-looking musicians in black tuxedos were huddled around him, their faces pale under the stage lights. "It is impossible," the conductor was saying, his voice thick with a dramatic European accent that made everything sound like a life-or-death situation. "The harpist has vertigo. She cannot get out of bed." The opening piece is a duet for violin and harp. A duet. It is the heart of the entire program. A woman in a sharp pantsuit, probably the university's events coordinator, was wringing her hands so tightly her knuckles were white. "We've called everyone. The City Philharmonic can't spare anyone on such short notice. We even tried the Music Academy. No one can learn the part in just a few hours. They do not have to learn it," the conductor thundered, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "They have to feel it. This is not just notes on a page. This is a conversation between two souls." They were stuck. The gala was sold out. Important donors and city officials were in the audience. Canceling the duet would be a public and financial disaster. Leo, feeling like a complete outsider, kept his head down and began to mop the corner of the stage. His movements slow and methodical, a silent machine in a room full of panicked humans. He was trying to make himself as unnoticeable as possible. The conductor threw his elegant hands up in the air, a gesture of pure operatic defeat. "This is a catastrophe of the highest order." The small group of musicians and staff muttered amongst themselves, the air thick with their collective helplessness. Leo wrung out his mop, the dirty water sloshing in the bucket. He could feel their frustration, their desperation. It was a familiar feeling. That feeling of being completely stuck, facing a problem with no visible solution. And then, for the first time in weeks, a thought that wasn't filled with self-pity flickered in his mind. The harp part for that duet, he knew it. Not perfectly, but he knew it. He had downloaded the sheet music months ago out of sheer curiosity, fascinated by its complexity and its beauty. He had spent a few nights trying to pluck out the melody on his old acoustic guitar, adapting the intricate harp runs for 6 strings instead of 47. It had been a challenge, a fun puzzle to distract him from his weary reality. He had never played a real harp in his life, but the music lived in his head. It was one of the most beautiful things he had ever heard. The thought was insane. It was ridiculous. He was the janitor. But then he thought of Alina. He thought of her worried face, of her plea for him to prove it. He thought of the heavy silence that had settled between them. What did he have left to lose? His pride? He felt like he had none left to lose. His heart started pounding, a frantic, desperate drum against his ribs. He felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made him feel dizzy. He leaned his mop against a large speaker and took a hesitant step out of the shadows and into the dim light of the stage. "Excuse me," he said. His voice came out as a quiet squeak, barely audible over the anxious chatter. No one heard him. They were too wrapped up in their own crisis, their own world of high art and high stakes. He cleared his throat. A little louder this time, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the hall. "Excuse me?" The frantic conversation died. Everyone on stage turned to look at him. The conductor, the musicians, the event coordinator. Their faces were a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Who was this man in the stained janitor's uniform, with his bucket and his worn-out shoes, interrupting their private catastrophe? The conductor's eyes narrowed. Yes, what is it? We are in the middle of a crisis here. Leo's throat felt dry and tight. All the false confidence, born of a momentary flicker of madness, was starting to evaporate. He could feel a dozen pairs of eyes on him, a silent, collective judgment. He felt like an imposter, a cockroach on a pristine white tablecloth. But then he pictured Elena's face, her expression, a mix of love and fear. And the words came out, surprising even himself. I play a little, he said, his voice still quiet but steady. I could try. For a moment, there was just stunned silence. Then a few of the musicians let out short, incredulous, almost pitying laughs. The event coordinator looked at him as if he had just suggested he could fly. A little... The conductor scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. This is a masterpiece, not a simple folk song. Who are you? Leo, he said simply. I'm the janitor. Exactly, the conductor said, as if that proved his point. This is not a skill learned by pushing a broom. This is a lifetime of dedication, of soul. Just then, the university's music director, a kind-faced man named Dr. Alistair Finch, who Leo knew from seeing him around the halls, came rushing onto the stage. He had been alerted to the emergency. He took in the scene the furious conductor, the panicked staff, and the lone janitor standing awkwardly in the middle of it all. He recognized Leo instantly. Maestro, Dr. Finch said, addressing the conductor with a calm that was a stark contrast to the man's hysteria. What is going on? This person, the conductor sputtered, gesturing at Leo with distaste, claims he can play the harp part. Dr. Finch looked at Leo, a thoughtful expression on his face. He remembered the faint, beautiful melodies he would sometimes hear late at night when he was working late in his office. He remembered seeing this young man sitting alone in a practice room, completely lost in the music, the world outside the window fading away. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew a musician when he felt one. Leo, Dr. Finch said, his voice gentle. You play music? A little, sir. On my guitar. Have you seen this piece before? The duet. Leo nodded, his eyes still wide with a fear he was trying to hide. Yes, sir. It's beautiful. Dr. Finch turned back to the conductor. Maestro, with all due respect, we have an audience of 1,000 people out there, including the mayor and our most generous donor. The show starts in an hour. We have no other options. What is the harm in letting him try? The conductor looked at Leo as if he were a bug he wanted to crush. He was a man of pristine artistry, of high culture, and this suggestion was a profound insult. But Dr. Finch was right. What other choice did he have? Letting the maestro perform without the harp was a bigger humiliation. He let out a long, dramatic sigh, a sound of profound artistic suffering. Fine, he snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. 5 minutes. Get him a harp. A practice harp. If he is a disaster, he is out of here, and we will play an encore in its place. One of the stagehands scurried off and returned a minute later with a smaller, less ornate practice harp. They placed it on a center stage stool. It was a magnificent instrument, even the practice version, all gleaming wood and intricate strings. It looked alien and intimidating under the bright stage lights. Leo walked toward it. His hands, which were so accustomed to the rough wood of his guitar and the grimy handle of his mop, felt clumsy and large. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, a heavy weight of skepticism and disbelief. He could hear their silent thoughts, and they echoed his own, the janitor. This is a waste of time. He's going to make a fool of himself. He sat down on the stool. The chair felt too high, the harp felt too big. He ran his fingers over the strings, and a sound of discordant notes echoed in the massive hall like a clumsy question. He felt a surge of panic. What was he doing? He was going to embarrass himself. He was going to be a joke, a story they told for years about the crazy janitor who thought he could be a musician. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, shutting out their judgment. He blocked out the image of the conductor's disdain, the sound of the musicians whispering. He didn't think about Alina. He didn't think about the promise. He thought only of the music. He didn't see a harp. He saw the notes in his mind. He didn't see strings. He saw the melody, the way it flowed and danced like a ribbon of light. He let his fingers, which knew the music so well from his late-night sessions with his guitar, find their place. They were seeking a familiar friend in an unfamiliar land. And then he began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, but then his fingers remembered. The complex, cascading melody that the symphony had struggled with for hours began to flow from him. It wasn't perfect. His technique wasn't that of a trained harpist. There was no delicate, practiced finesse, but it was there. The music was there. It was full of a raw, untaught emotion, a soulfulness that no amount of formal training could replicate. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was telling their story. He was pouring all his doubt, all his frustration, all his unspoken love for Alina, all his tired hope into the music. It was the sound of a janitor's soul, given a voice. The entire hall fell into a profound, absolute silence. The conductor stood with his mouth slightly agape, his face a canvas of disbelief slowly transforming into pure, unadulterated awe. The musicians, who had been smirking moments before, now stared with wide eyes. Dr. Finch had a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. Leo played for what felt like an eternity and for no time at all. When the last note hung in the air, a single, perfect shimmer of sound in the cavernous hall, he opened his eyes. There was no applause. There was just the sound of 100 people holding their breath. The conductor slowly walked across the stage, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished wood. He stopped in front of Leo, looking not at him but at the harp, as if it were a magical object that had suddenly come to life. Then he looked at Leo, his expression one of utter, complete astonishment. "Who are you?" He asked again, but this time the question was not one of disdain, but of genuine, burning curiosity. "Leo," said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "The janitor." The conductor shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear it of a fog. A slow, real smile broke across his face, a genuine, crinkle-eyed smile that reached all the way to his wild white hair. He reached out and placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture that felt both weighty and incredibly light. "No," he said, his voice filled with a new reverence. "You are not the janitor." He leaned in closer, his eyes intense. "You are a musician. And tonight," he said, his voice ringing with newfound conviction, "you will play with my symphony." He paused, letting the words sink in, before delivering the final, life-altering blow. "You will play this duet for me." And after the concert, he said, his grip tightening slightly on Leo's shoulder, "You and I will talk about your future." The word future echoed in his ears long after the conductor. Maestro Kozłowski had swept away in a flurry of dramatic instructions. Leo was left standing in a state of surreal confusion, a borrowed tuxedo feeling both too big and too small all at once. The next hour was a blur of activity he was completely unprepared for. He was whisked away to a small, cramped dressing room, where a stern-looking woman with a clipboard fussed over his hair and gave him a small cup of warm water with lemon, telling him it was good for his throat. He was just a man who mopped floors, and now people were bringing him water. It felt like he had walked into someone else's life by mistake. Backstage, the air was electric. Musicians in their black suits and dresses were tuning their instruments, their faces a mix of focus and pre-show jitters. A few of them nodded at him now, not with the earlier skepticism, but with a quiet, respectful curiosity. They saw the conductor's faith in him, and that was enough. He felt like an imposter, but he also felt a strange sense of belonging he had never felt before. These people understood the language he spoke, the language of melody and harmony. From the wings, he could hear the murmur of the audience filling the grand hall. It was a low, rumbling sound, like a distant ocean, and it made his stomach clench with a terror so sharp it almost took his breath away. He thought of Alina. He had managed to call her earlier, his voice shaking so much he could barely get the words out. He hadn't told her everything. How could he? He just said, "I have a gig. A really important one. At the university concert hall. Can you come?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a pause filled with all their recent history of disappointment. Then she had said, her voice soft but uncertain, "Okay, Leo, I'll be there." He knew she was coming, not out of belief, but out of a lingering, stubborn love. He hoped, with every fiber of his being, that he wouldn't break that love completely. A stagehand with a headset peered out at the crowd. "5 minutes, folks," he said, his voice a low murmur. Maestro is taking the stage. The world seemed to narrow to a single point of focus. Leo looked out through the small gap in the heavy velvet curtain. He could see the sea of faces, a blur of evening gowns and dark suits, glittering jewelry and expectant eyes. And then he saw her. Alina was seated in the 10th row, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't dressed up. She was wearing her simple work clothes. She looked small and lost in the grandeur of the hall, and he felt a pang of guilt so intense it was almost physical. He had brought her here to this fancy place under false pretenses. He imagined her sitting there, expecting to see him, perhaps playing for 10 minutes in a corner before the real show started, feeling sorry for him. He imagined her preparing a gentle, "It was a good try" speech for afterward. The thought was a knife in his gut. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, and the low rumble of the crowd hushed to a reverent silence. The maestro walked out to the podium, and the audience erupted in polite, appreciative applause. He bowed, his white hair gleaming under the lights. He was in his element, a king on his throne. He raised his baton, and the symphony began to play. The music was magnificent, a powerful, sweeping piece that filled the hall and vibrated through the floorboards. Up through the soles of Leo's borrowed dress shoes. He stood in the wings, his heart pounding, the borrowed harp feeling like an anchor beside him. This was a real performance, with hundreds of people who had paid good money to be here. The weight of what he was about to do, the risk he was taking, was crushing. Then the maestro lowered his baton. The symphony fell silent. He turned to the audience, a warm, charismatic smile on his face. Thank you," he said, his voice carrying easily without a microphone. "Before we continue our program, we have a very special treat for you tonight. A discovery." A murmur went through the crowd. Sometimes the most beautiful art is found in the most unexpected places. Tonight, we have found a new voice. A young man who found his music not in a conservatory, but in the quiet corners of this very hall where he works. Leo felt his breath catch. He saw Alina sit up a little straighter in her seat, her brow furrowed in confusion. "He will play for you now," the maestro continued, his voice full of a proud paternal warmth. With his guitar, single bright spotlight cut through the darkness. Sweeping across the stage and landing on Leo, he felt it like a physical force. For a second, he froze, blinded by the light, paralyzed by the 1,000 pairs of eyes suddenly fixed on him. He was just Leo, the janitor, in a too-tight tux. But then he took a breath, and he thought of the music. He stepped out onto the stage, his old acoustic guitar in his hands. It felt more familiar and more right than the elegant harp ever could. He sat on the simple stool they had placed center stage. The audience was completely still. He could see Elena's face clearly now, illuminated by the soft glow from the stage. Her mouth was slightly open, her expression a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, impossible hope. She had no idea what was happening. None of them did. He closed his eyes, letting the noise of the world fade away. He didn't think about the conductor or the symphony or the audience. He thought only of her. He thought of their small apartment, of her worried face, of the ultimatum that had both broken him and rebuilt him. And then he began to play. The song that came out was not the duet. It was something new, something he had been crafting in the long, lonely hours of the night. It was the story of them. The first notes were soft and hesitant, like the beginning of their love, a simple, hopeful melody. He played of mopping floors and dreaming, of the smell of garlic and the taste of cheap wine. His fingers told of the late nights and the early mornings, of the exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. The melody grew more complex, more sorrowful, with minor keys that spoke of doubt and fear. It was the sound of their argument, the sound of her worry, the sound of his own frustration, and the crushing weight of feeling like a failure. It was the sound of a dream that felt like it was dying. And then the music began to change. It was not a sudden shift, but a slow, gradual climb. A new melody began to weave its way through the old sorrow, a melody of resilience, of stubborn, unkillable hope. It was the sound of finding the sheet music on a whim, of the crazy, insane idea to step out of the shadows. It was the sound of his fingers finding the strings, of the conductor's astonished face, of the disbelief slowly turning to belief. The music swelled, growing louder and more confident, his fingers flying across the frets. It was a conversation, a debate, and finally, a resolution. The melody soared, a powerful, triumphant declaration of a soul, refusing to be silent. It was the sound of a janitor proving he was a musician. It was the sound of a love being tested and emerging, not broken, but stronger. It was a promise kept. He played with an honesty that was raw and vulnerable. He was not performing for them. He was confessing to her. Every note was a word he couldn't say, every chord a feeling he couldn't express. He poured all of himself, the grime, the beauty, the fear, the hope into the 6 strings of his old, beat-up guitar. When he played the final note, he let it hang in the air, a single, ringing sound that was both a question and an answer. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, sacred silence. He slowly opened his eyes and looked directly at her. In the 10th row, Alina was crying. Not just a few stray tears, but deep, silent sobs that shook her entire body. She had her hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes were wide, not with shock, but with a profound, soul-shattering understanding. She wasn't just hearing a song. She was seeing him, truly seeing him, for the first time. She saw the depth of his struggle, the weight of his heart, and the immensity of his love. The music had stripped away all the fear and the practicality and the disappointment. It had laid bare the beautiful, aching truth of his soul. And then, a single person in the back of the hall started to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap, and it was quickly joined by another, and another, until a thunderous, deafening roar of applause and cheers erupted, filling the vast hall. The entire audience was on its feet, a standing ovation that felt like it could lift the roof off the building. It was an overwhelming, cathartic wave of sound, a validation that washed over him and left him breathless. But he wasn't looking at them. He only had eyes for her. In the middle of the ovation, she finally stood up. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was smiling. A smile so bright and full of love and awe that it was the only thing in the world he could see. She clapped her hands together, her applause lost in the roar of the crowd. But for him, it was the only sound that mattered. The music hadn't just left her speechless. It had spoken a language more profound than any words. He had proved it. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over him and threatened to pull him under. For a long moment, he just sat there on the stool, his guitar across his lap, his mind completely blank. The world was a blur of light and sound. He saw faces, hundreds of them, all turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of awe and joy. He heard applause, a thunderous, relentless rhythm that vibrated through the floorboards and up into his bones. But it all felt distant, like he was watching it happen to someone else then. Through the haze, he saw her face. Alina still standing, still clapping, her cheeks wet with tears. But her smile was a beacon, cutting through everything. That was his anchor. That was what was real. The maestro came back onto the stage, his face beaming with a pride that felt almost fatherly. He gestured for Leo to stand, and the applause grew even louder, if that was possible. Leo felt his legs shake as he stood, bowing awkwardly, not knowing what else to do. He felt like a fraud. He wasn't a star. He was just a man who had poured his heart out on a stage. The concert continued, but he was barely aware of it. He was led backstage again into a world of controlled chaos. People were patting him on the back, shaking his hand, saying things he couldn't quite process. Magnificent. Incredible. Where have you been hiding? Their words were just sounds, meaningless vibrations in the air. All he could think about was her. He had to find her. As soon as the final triumphant notes of the symphony faded and the applause for the main event began, he slipped away, navigating the maze of corridors and equipment backstage. He needed to get back to their small, quiet apartment. He needed to see her, not in a crowded hall, but in the space they had built together. He pushed through a heavy side door and out into the cool night air. The city hummed around him, but it felt peaceful after the intensity of the performance. He started the short walk home, his borrowed tuxedo feeling strange and stiff on his frame. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know what he would say. He just knew he had to see her. When he unlocked the door to their apartment, he found her sitting on the sofa. She hadn't turned on the main light. The only illumination came from the small lamp on the end table, casting long shadows across the room. She was holding a teacup in her hands, but it was empty. She looked up as he came in, and her eyes, red from crying, met his. The air between them was thick with everything that had just happened, so with all the words that hadn't been said for months. For a second, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other across the small, familiar space. His guitar was still in the corner where he'd left it. The stain on the ceiling was still there. It was their apartment, their life, but something had fundamentally shifted. She was the first to move. She put the cup down on the coffee table and stood up, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't walk toward him with words. She walked toward him with her heart and her eyes. She closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He felt the dampness of her tears against the fabric of the tuxedo. She held him so tightly he could barely breathe. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, Leo, I am so, so sorry." He held her, his own arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. He could feel her body trembling slightly. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He rested his cheek against her hair, breathing in the scent that was so familiar, so home. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said softly, his voice hoarse. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands framing his face. Her eyes searched his, and what she saw there made fresh tears well up. "I was so scared," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I was scared for you. I was scared for us. I thought I was being practical, but I was just being a coward. I was trying to build a safe life, but I was asking you to build it with half a heart." He shook his head slowly. "You weren't a coward. You were just trying to love me the best way you knew how. You were the one who asked me to fight for it. You're the reason I was on that stage tonight." "You fought," she said, a watery smile breaking through. "God, Leo, you fought. I heard it. I heard every single fight. I heard every late night, every mop bucket, every doubt, and every bit of love. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in my entire life." He felt his own eyes start to burn. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that. He hadn't realized how much he needed her to understand. In that moment, he felt the last of the resentment and frustration from the past few months melt away. It was gone. All that was left was her and the music, and a future that suddenly felt wide open and full of light. He took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment. He had proven his music was real. Now he had to prove their love was. He gently took her hands in his, lowering himself to one knee right there on their worn-out living room rug. The gesture was so unexpected, so classic, that she let out a small, tearful laugh of surprise. "Elena," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't contain. "You told me that night that if I could prove it, you would marry me. I think I proved it." A sob escaped her lips, and she nodded. Unable to speak, he reached into the inner pocket of the tuxedo jacket, a pocket he had almost forgotten about. The conductor had insisted on it, pressing a small, velvet box into his hand before he went on stage, saying, "A musician's heart should never be empty." Leo opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a simple, elegant ring. It wasn't extravagant. It was perfect. He looked up at her, his eyes clear and certain. "I spent all this time trying to prove my music to you. But the music was just the song. You're the reason? You're my whole reason. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. I proved it for the world tonight, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Now, I want to prove it for you. For the rest of my life, will you marry me? Alina looked down at him, at the man kneeling on their floor in a borrowed tux, holding out a future she never dared to dream was possible. She saw the man who scrubbed floors, the man who played guitar until his fingers bled, the man who carried her fears in his own without ever letting go. She saw him, all of him. Through a fresh wave of tears she laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, she whispered, then said it again, louder, stronger. Yes, of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. He stood up, and she was in his arms again. Their kiss, not one of passionate reunion, but of deep, quiet, and utter peace. It was the kiss of a promise fulfilled. Their life didn't magically transform overnight. He still had a lot to figure out. The maestro's offer of a future was real, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. There were calls to make, decisions to face, a path to forge that was brand new and completely unknown. But they would face it together. The ultimatum that had once felt like a final, desperate test had become the very foundation of their story. In the end, the janitor's music didn't just leave one woman speechless. It had rewritten their entire world, turning a small apartment with a water stain on the ceiling into the starting point of a beautiful, messy, and wonderfully real life. It was a true life story, written not just in notes, but in the quiet, resilient beat of two hearts, finally, perfectly in sync.